What if the fastest way for a great power to destroy itself is to believe it cannot be stopped? What if the same mistake that shattered Napoleon and Hitler is unfolding again in our own time? If you love videos that turn history into a warning you can actually use, hit like, subscribe, and share this with the one friend who always asks what the bigger pattern is. There is a reason this story keeps returning. It is not because history is lazy. It is because power changes how leaders see the world. The stronger they become, the more they confuse momentum with destiny. They stop asking, can we win, and start asking, how fast will we win? That one mental shift sounds small. In practice, it can ruin nations. Tonight, I want to show you a pattern that is bigger than any one ruler, bigger than any one war, and more dangerous than most people realize. Napoleon crossed into Russia, certain that his victories had changed the rules. Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, believing speed and force would solve everything. Putin launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, after years of projecting power and testing the world's response. 3 different leaders, 3 different centuries, different ideologies, different armies, different weapons, but the same trap. And the trap is not simply invading a large country. That is too shallow. The real trap is invading a determined society while carrying a false picture of reality. It is entering a war with a map in your hand and a fantasy in your head. It is believing your past victories tell you more about the future than the enemy's will to resist. Once that happens, the disaster has already started, even if the first headlines look like success. Most people explain these failures with one-word answers. Winter, distance, bad logistics, bad luck. Those things matter. Of course they do. But they are not the deepest cause. Winter did not invent arrogance. Mud did not create bad assumptions. Supply collapse does not appear out of nowhere, like a curse. Those are the bills that arrive after a leader has already made the deeper mistake. They are symptoms of a broken plan, not the original disease. The disease is overconfidence mixed with blindness. A powerful state wins so often that it begins to believe resistance is just a delay. It stops seeing other people as political communities with memory, pride, fear, and endurance. It sees them as targets, terrain, and timelines. That is why these wars begin with confidence and end with confusion. The invader thinks it is attacking an army. In reality, it is provoking a whole system. Let's start with Napoleon, because his case is the cleanest way to see the pattern. By 1812, he was not some reckless amateur stumbling into history. He was the dominant military force in Europe. He had broken coalitions, redrawn borders, and built a reputation so huge that many enemies had learned to fear him before the battle even started. Success was not new to him. Success was the environment he lived in. That is exactly why Russia became so dangerous. According to Britannica, the French invasion of Russia began on June 24, 1812. Over the course of the campaign, about 612,000 soldiers entered Russia. Think about that scale for a second. More than 600,000 men. For that era, it was staggering. This was not a desperate gamble by a declining power. It was a giant moving with confidence. And confidence can be useful, right up until it becomes a filter. Napoleon believed he was bringing the kind of war that had worked for him before. Move fast. Force a decisive battle. Take key ground. Break the enemy's position. Push the political system to negotiate. That model had logic. It had worked. The problem was not that Napoleon had no plan. The problem was that his plan depended on Russia behaving like the states he had already beaten. Russia did not behave that way. The Russians used a long withdrawal strategy that denied him the clean final showdown he needed. They kept moving back. They kept refusing to collapse on schedule. They made space itself part of the war. Every mile Napoleon advanced made his own army weaker. Every delay helped the defender more than the attacker. That is when a campaign stops being a battle of strength and starts becoming a battle of assumptions. Then came Moscow, the moment many people imagine as victory. Napoleon entered the city on September 14th with about 95,000 men. But the city did not give him what capitals are supposed to give conquerors. It did not produce a neat political ending. Britannica notes that Moscow was fired that night, at least partly by the Russians themselves. Napoleon had reached the symbolic prize, yet the prize had been emptied out. He had captured the shell without controlling the outcome. This matters because it reveals the real weakness of imperial overreach. Overreaching powers do not only misjudge military resistance, they misjudge what the capture of a city means. They assume geography creates submission. But if the population and leadership refuse to play their assigned role, the script breaks. The invader stands inside a famous city and discovers he is no closer to a real victory, and the losses tell the rest of the story. Britannica reports that of the 612,000 combatants who entered Russia, only about 112,000 returned to the frontier. Even more striking, most of Napoleon's losses happened before the first snowfall. That point matters so much because it kills the lazy explanation. The winter was brutal, yes, But the disaster began earlier. It began when Napoleon drove a huge army deep into a hostile system he did not truly understand. So what ended the campaign? Not one heroic moment, not one dramatic twist. It was the slow revenge of reality. The supply lines stretched, the assumptions failed, the enemy refused the neat ending. The cost kept rising while the political results stayed out of reach. That is the pattern. The empire keeps spending, time stops helping it, and every extra step forward makes the return home harder. Now look at Hitler. Different regime, different century, far worse moral darkness. But structurally, the trap looks hauntingly familiar. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Britannica describes it as the largest and most powerful invasion force in history at that point. Nearly 150 divisions, about 3 million men, around 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft spread across a front about 1,800 miles long. That sounds like overwhelming force because it was overwhelming force. This is important. History is not telling us that these leaders were weak and panicked. It is telling us that peak power can be the most dangerous mental state of all. Hitler had just seen Germany rack up victories that made speed look magical. In that atmosphere, success becomes evidence for every future gamble. The German expectation was brutally simple. Britannica says Hitler and his generals expected victory in 2 to 3 months. That assumption was not a side detail. It was the center of the entire design. A campaign planned for quick victory behaves very differently from a campaign built for endurance. It burns fuel differently. It measures risk differently. It imagines the enemy differently. A short war fantasy creates long war fragility. And once again, the defender refused to behave according to the invader's timetable. The Soviet Union did not fall apart on cue. German estimates badly misread Soviet reserves. Britannica notes that while German planners estimated 150 Soviet divisions with about 50 more possible, the Soviets brought up more than 200 fresh divisions by mid-August. In other words, the war Germany thought it was finishing was still expanding under its feet. This is one of the deepest lessons in the whole story. Powerful states often measure what they can see and discount what they cannot. Tanks can be counted, aircraft can be counted, divisions can be counted, but replacement capacity, political fear, patriotic rage, and a government's willingness to absorb pain are much harder to calculate. Leaders say they are being realistic because they have numbers, but numbers without a human model can become a very refined form of self-deception. And like Napoleon, Hitler discovered that moving deeper did not bring him closer to a stable ending. It brought him deeper into a war whose scale changed the meaning of distance, time, and survival. The German advance was enormous. Britannica says that by mid-July, German forces had advanced more than 400 miles and were only about 200 miles from Moscow. Yet the campaign still failed to defeat Soviet forces, and Britannica calls that failure a crucial turning point in the war. Quick pause before we go further. If this pattern is clicking for you, subscribe now so you do not miss the next breakdown. Hit like if you want more history that explains the present, and share this video with someone who still thinks strength always means control. So now we have two giant examples, and both tell the same brutal truth. The issue is not just whether an army is strong. The issue is whether a state understands the kind of war it is starting. A leader can win the opening move and still lose the logic of the conflict. He can occupy territory and still fail to control the meaning of the war. He can terrify opponents and still awaken a kind of resistance he cannot manage. That brings us to Putin and Ukraine. On February 24, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Britannica says Russian forces made significant gains in the first days of combat. So yes, at the beginning, there was visible momentum. There was movement. There was shock. There was fear. That is often how Overreach looks in its opening phase. It does not look foolish. It looks forceful. But Britannica also says something else. Ukrainian defenders rebuffed attempts to seize Kyiv and other major cities and soon launched counterattacks. The advance on Kyiv collapsed because of determined Ukrainian resistance and obvious shortcomings in Russia's logistics. That sentence is not just battlefield description. It is the same old pattern in modern form. The attacker expects speed. The defender survives the first blow. The war changes shape. Britannica states that it seems clear Putin's plan had been to seize Kyiv within days and install a pro-Moscow government. That is the key Overreach assumption in one line. The political ending was supposed to arrive almost immediately. In the early hours of the invasion, an elite Russian paratrooper unit captured Hostomel Airport. Teams from the Wagner Group were sent to Kyiv to target key figures in the Ukrainian government. That is what a short war mind looks like. It plans not just to attack, but to replace the political center before resistance can harden. But the political center did not vanish. Zelensky stayed in the capital. Britannica notes his famous line when offered evacuation, "The fight is here, I need ammunition, not a ride." You do not have to turn that into myth to see its importance. In wars like this, symbols are not decoration, they are fuel. A leader staying put tells soldiers, citizens, and foreign partners that the state is still alive. It can turn fear into resolve, faster than tanks can turn roads into victory. And here is where the historical pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Napoleon expected political collapse after military penetration. Hitler expected political collapse after military shock. Putin expected political collapse after a fast strike on the capital. In every case, the invader believed the defender's will was softer than it really was. That is the repeating error. Not just misjudging equipment, misjudging spirit. When people hear the word spirit, they sometimes think it sounds vague or poetic. It is not vague at all. Spirit changes hard outcomes. It determines whether cities are defended or abandoned. It determines whether officials flee or stay. It determines whether allies invest more or back away. It determines whether a population accepts occupation as fate or treats every week of survival as a political victory. The problem for invading powers is that spirit often becomes strongest after the attack begins. That is why these leaders are often most wrong at the exact moment they feel most certain. Their confidence is based on the world before they invade. But invasion itself changes the world. It creates new loyalties, new fears, new hatreds, new alliances, and new forms of national identity. The attacker thinks it is stepping into a fixed situation. In reality, it is detonating one. We can see that change in the international response too. NATO says Finland became the alliance's 31st member on April 4, 2023, and Sweden became the 32nd member on March 7, 2024. Those dates matter because they show how overreach can strengthen the very security structures it hoped to intimidate or weaken. A move meant to expand one state's control can push other states to coordinate more tightly against it. NATO also says allies strengthened the comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine, turned it into a multi-year program, and in December 2024 established NATO Security Assistance and Training for Ukraine, known as NSATU, to place support on a more enduring basis. As of June 2026, NATO says allies have committed billions in military and non-lethal aid, while Reuters reported in March 2026 that NATO allies would keep supporting Ukraine. Again, look at the structure. Overreach does not just create resistance at the front, it creates organization behind the front. This is one reason Imperial overreach becomes so dangerous. It wakes up sleeping systems. Before the invasion, other countries may disagree, delay, or hesitate. After the invasion, they no longer argue about abstract risks. They are reacting to a live example. Threat becomes easier to name. Budgets become easier to justify. Neutrality becomes harder to defend. The overreaching power thinks it is isolating the target. Often it ends up isolating itself. So if the pattern is this clear, why do leaders keep walking into it? Why does power not learn? Why does victory in one setting produce stupidity in the next? The answer is not that rulers suddenly become insane. The answer is more normal and more frightening. Success changes incentives. It punishes caution and rewards boldness. It fills the room with people who know how to execute a plan, not people who dare to destroy the plan before it begins. Think about what happens inside a powerful system at its peak. The leader has won before. The military has prestige. The intelligence services know what the leader wants to hear. Subordinates understand the mood of the room. No one wants to be the person who sounds weak, fearful, or unpatriotic. So bad assumptions spread upward wrapped in confidence. Warnings become softer. Doubts arrive later. Optimism turns from a feeling into a career strategy. That is why overreach is often born in strong states, not weak ones. Weak states know they are weak. Strong states can forget they are limited. They begin to treat limits as insults. They stop asking whether the enemy can endure pain longer than they expected. They stop asking whether their own economy, politics, and public patience are built for a drawn-out fight. They assume the war will stay inside the box they drew for it. But war does not stay in the box. It leaks. It spreads into finance, diplomacy, morale, industry, and time. The invader must keep paying every day. The defender only has to keep refusing the outcome. That difference is enormous. The stronger army may have more weapons, but the defender often has the simpler political mission: survive, deny, endure, and make occupation too costly. History shows that this mission can be enough to break powers that looked untouchable on paper. Here's another way to say it. The attacker needs a positive result. The defender often only needs a negative one. The attacker must install control. The defender must prevent control. The attacker must prove strength again and again across distance. The defender must keep turning every delay into evidence that the attacker miscalculated. That is why long wars tend to poison the invader more than the invaded, especially when the defender still has leadership, identity, and outside support. And that outside support matters. Once a war reveals that the target will resist, outside powers face a different calculation. Helping a doomed victim feels risky. Helping a stubborn defender feels strategic. The longer the defender survives, the easier it becomes for others to justify aid. Each month of resistance can attract more training, more equipment, more money, more sanctions on the aggressor, and more diplomatic isolation. The invader thought time was on its side because it had more force. Instead, time slowly recruits new enemies. This is where empire begins to suffocate on its own success story. It has told itself for years that it is decisive, feared, and exceptional. Then it enters a war that demands patience, humility, adaptation, and political restraint. Those are not usually the habits empire practices most. Empire is good at expansion. It is often terrible at hearing the word no. And in a determined land war, no is exactly what it hears every day. Maybe that is the deepest answer in all three cases. Napoleon, Hitler, and Putin did not simply underestimate an opponent. They overestimated what force can do when it collides with nationhood. They treated society like a door that could be kicked open. But society is not a door, it is a web. Cut one part and strain moves elsewhere. Seize one city, and resistance moves to another place. Eliminate one unit, and memory hardens in civilians. Destroy infrastructure, and hatred becomes infrastructure. And yes, material power still matters. We should not romanticize resistance as if courage alone wins wars. Courage without supplies can be crushed. Leadership without allies can break. But that is exactly why the overreach trap is so deadly. It combines military conflict with political activation. The defender's will buys time. Time attracts aid. Aid strengthens resistance. Resistance denies quick victory. The denied victory raises the invader's costs. Rising costs deepen the invader's political problem. Then the loop feeds itself. One more pause, because this is the point most people miss. If this video is helping you see the news with sharper eyes, tap like, join the channel, and send it to one person who thinks history is just dates instead of patterns. Now let's go one level deeper. The real issue is not Russia alone. It is not even land war alone. The real issue is what happens when a successful power starts believing its own mythology. Mythology is useful in politics. It creates pride. It creates unity. It creates will. But mythology becomes poison when leaders mistake it for analysis. Once that happens, evidence stops correcting them. Evidence gets edited until it fits the story they want. That is why hubris is more than ordinary arrogance. Ordinary arrogance says, I am strong. Hubris says, the rules that limit others do not limit me. It says distance will matter less for me. Resistance will matter less for me. Economics will matter less for me. Time will matter less for me. Hubris does not deny facts one by one. It creates a mental atmosphere where inconvenient facts lose emotional weight. Then comes the second stage, escalation without clarity. Because once the quick victory fails, the overreaching power faces a humiliating choice. It can reduce its aims and admit the original plan was flawed. Or it can double down and hope more force will rescue the dream. Most leaders choose the second path for a while, because politically it feels easier than confession. But every extra month makes confession harder, and failure costlier. So the war drags on, even when the original logic is already broken. You can see why this becomes self-reinforcing. Early optimism creates a reckless plan. The reckless plan creates early setbacks. Early setbacks create a need to save face. Saving face creates escalation. Escalation creates deeper costs. Deeper costs create a stronger need to justify the sacrifice. At that point, the war is no longer being fought only against the enemy. It is being fought against the leader's own inability to say, we misjudged this from the start. And that is why the title of this video matters so much. Napoleon did this. Hitler did this. Putin is doing this. History has one answer. Not because history is magical. Not because outcomes are simple. But because the structure keeps punishing the same mistake. When a great power launches a major war of control against a determined society on its own ground, while assuming quick political collapse, the war stops being a display of strength and turns into a machine that grinds the attacker down. Notice what history's answer is not. It is not, the weaker side always wins. That would be false. It is not, every invasion fails. That would also be false. History's answer is more precise. If a powerful state mistakes military entry for political mastery, if it misreads the defender's will, if it enters a conflict that expands faster than it can control, then its own strength becomes part of the trap. The bigger the force, the bigger the bill when the plan is wrong. And that brings us to a warning that goes beyond this war. Any great power can fall into this pattern. Any capital can start believing its reach is proof of wisdom. Any military can confuse capacity with control. Any ruling class can become trapped inside its own success story. This is not a Russian problem alone. It is a permanent temptation of power. The names change. The illusion stays. So let me leave you with the question that matters most. What actually defeats empires in moments like these? Is it winter? Is it one great general? Sometimes those things matter. But the deeper answer is simpler and more unsettling. Empires are often defeated by the reality they refuse to study, by the people they treated as background, by the time they assumed belonged to them, by the coalitions their own actions created, and by the pride that made retreat feel impossible until retreat became unavoidable. That is why this pattern should stay with you. Because it is not only about the past. It is a test you can apply whenever leaders start talking like power has canceled complexity, whenever they act as if speed will replace legitimacy, whenever they assume fear will do the political work that only consent can do, whenever they believe taking the capital means taking the country. That is the moment to pay attention. Napoleon did not lose because Russia was cold. Hitler did not fail because maps were unfair, and the war in Ukraine is not only a story about weapons. In all three cases, the deeper problem is the same. Power looked at a living nation and saw a manageable object. It looked at resistance and called it temporary. It looked at warning signs and called them obstacles on the way to an inevitable victory. History has answered that mistake before. It is answering it again now, and the answer is brutal every time. If you invade a determined people on their own ground while blinded by your own strength, the war you start to prove your power can become the war that exposes its limits. That is the lesson. That is the warning. And for every leader who thinks this time will be different, history is waiting with the same reply.